Late in 1913, a drill rig belonging to the Picher Lead Company got stuck in 5 feet of mud on the Oklahoma prairie. It was being hauled to a new site, and a thunderstorm had turned the road into soup. The foreman wired Oliver S. Picher in Joplin, Missouri, and told him the rig couldn't be moved. Picher, who had been prospecting the Quapaw lands for years without finding anything worth mining, sent back a one-line reply, "Drill where you are." The men drilled. And what came up was one of the richest lead-zinc ore concentrates anyone in the tri-state district had ever seen. Within 2 years, that accidental borehole had led to 20 more strikes. Within 5 years, a city of nearly 10,000 people stood on the spot where the rig got stuck. Within a decade, that city was producing more than half the lead and zinc consumed by the United States military in the First World War. And within a century, every single building, the churches, the high school, the pharmacy, the houses where children were raised, would be torn down, and the federal government would pay the last residents to leave because the ground beneath them was no longer safe to stand on. The town was named after the man who said, "Drill where you are." It should have been named after what was underneath. The land belonged to the Quapaw. It had belonged to them since 1834, when they were relocated from Arkansas to a reservation in the extreme northeast corner of Indian Territory, a rectangle of rolling prairie wedged between Kansas and Missouri. In 1893, anticipating the federal government's allotment policies, the Quapaw divided their communal land into 200-acre parcels for each enrolled member, a strategic move that gave them 3 times the acreage the government would have assigned. For a brief moment, it looked like foresight might protect them. It didn't. In 1897, a federal ruling allowed the leasing of Quapaw allotments for mining. By 1905, prospectors had found lead and zinc deposits on the reservation. And here's where the economics of the arrangement become important. The leases were managed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, not by the Quapaw themselves. If an allottee refused to sign a lease, the BIA could declare that person incompetent and sign for them. Roughly 1/6 of the Quapaw were ever able to collect meaningful royalties. In the fiscal year ending June 1926, the peak of everything, mines on Quapaw restricted land produced $17.6 million in zinc and lead concentrate. 43 individual Quapaw shared in the royalties, which totaled $1.68 million, about 9.5 cents on every dollar pulled from their ground. The rest went to the companies. And the largest of those companies, the one that would define the district for half a century, was Eagle-Picher. Oliver S. Picher had been running the Picher Lead Company out of Joplin since the 1890s. After the 1913 discovery, he merged with the Eagle White Lead Company of Cincinnati to form Eagle-Picher, with Picher himself as president. He set the headquarters in Chicago, neutral ground between 2 corporate cultures that never quite got along. But the money came from Ottawa County, Oklahoma. All of it. The leasing rules imposed by the federal government required that an ore reduction mill be built on each 40-acre tract. This was meant to prevent any single operator from controlling too much land, but the practical effect was to scatter the landscape with an almost absurd density of industrial infrastructure. By 1927, there were 248 mills operating in the Picher field alone. 248 separate milling operations, grinding and crushing ore around the clock, each one producing its own mountain of leftover rock. That leftover rock was called chat. Crushed limestone, dolomite, silica, everything that wasn't lead or zinc, everything the mills couldn't sell, pushed aside into piles that grew and grew and never went away. In the early years, the Bureau of Indian Affairs told the mining companies to leave the chat on the surface for the Quapaw to sell as gravel. Officials soon tested it and found it contaminated with lead, cadmium, and arsenic. Unfit for sale, unfit for anything. So the piles just sat there. They grew to 100 feet, then 200, then 300. They became the skyline, and children played on them. There is a photograph from 1920 that shows Connell Avenue, Picher's main commercial street, and if you didn't know what you were looking at, you'd think it was a county seat 3 times its age. The town had gone from bare prairie to a functioning city in less than 7 years. Oklahoma newspapers at the time said it was born overnight, and for once the cliché was almost literally true. Within months of the first strikes, men were pouring in from Missouri, Kansas, Arkansas, and beyond, drawn by wages that were higher than farm labor and steady in a way that sharecropping never was. The speed was astonishing, but the ambition was what mattered. These weren't tents and saloons. Statewide papers reported the sudden appearance of masonry commercial buildings along Connell Avenue, a municipal water system that Eagle-Picher himself funded by drilling the city's first deep well, and a trolley line that ran all the way to Carthage, Missouri, 40 miles to the northeast, carrying miners to work and their families to shop. The trolley was critical. It knit Picher into a regional economy, connecting it to Joplin and the rail network beyond. Workers commuted daily from towns across two state lines. There were newspapers, including the Tri-State Tribune, which would chronicle the town for decades. There were churches, Baptist, Methodist, Christian, rising from the prairie as fast as the head frames. There was a high school built of brick, and the high school had a mascot, the Gorillas, and the Gorillas played football and basketball with a ferocity that became locally famous. On Friday nights, the gymnasium filled with miners and their families, and the roar could be heard blocks away. Years later, in 1984, the Gorillas football team would win the Oklahoma Class 1A state championship, a fact that the town eventually put on a plaque beneath the fiberglass gorilla on the corner, a monument that outlasted the school itself. At the peak, more than 14,000 men worked underground in the Picher field. Another 4,000 worked in the 1,500 mining service businesses that clustered around them: equipment suppliers, boarding houses, cafes, repair shops, the D&D drive-in that sold burgers on Connell Avenue. The mines ran 350 feet deep, not open pits, but networks of horizontal drifts and stopes. Room and pillar operations where miners blasted ore out of the walls and left columns of unmined rock in place to support the ceiling above them. The system was called random pillar mining, and it worked exactly as long as nobody went back and mined the pillars. Underground, the air was thick with dust, a fine, chalky particulate that coated everything and tasted like metal. The tunnels were dark, wet in some places, bone dry in others. Miners worked by carbide lamp, drilling blast holes by hand or with compressed air drills that threw even more dust into the already choked air. Timber shoring was minimal. Ventilation was whatever draft happened to move through the connecting shafts. The ore was loaded into carts, hauled to the shaft, hoisted to the surface, and dumped at the nearest mill. Every day, the mills processed 10 million pounds of crude ore, separating out the heavy galena and sphalerite, dumping the rest onto the chat piles. The timing was everything. World War I had created an insatiable demand for lead and zinc. Lead for bullets, zinc for brass cartridge casings, for galvanizing steel, for the linings of ammunition boxes. More than 50% of the lead and zinc consumed by the American military in the First World War came from the Picher field. By 1926, Ottawa County was the single largest source of lead and zinc on Earth. The money figures are hard to pin down precisely. The Oklahoma Historical Society cites a total of more than $20 billion in ore produced between 1917 and 1947, though earlier reports from the same agency put the 1908 to 1930 output at roughly $310 million, which suggests the larger figure may be calculated in adjusted dollars. Either way, the sums were enormous for a town that hadn't existed a decade earlier. One family in the area understood this boom from both sides. In 1934, a man named Elvin Mutt Mantle moved his wife and young son from Spavinaw, Oklahoma, to the nearby town of Commerce, about 5 miles south of Picher. Mutt took a job in the Eagle-Picher mines. The work was brutal, underground, in dust so thick you could taste it, hauling ore through tunnels where the temperature barely changed from season to season. But it was steady, and during the Depression, steady was everything. After his shifts, Mutt would come home and throw baseballs to his boy in the yard, teaching him to switch hit by alternating with the boy's left-handed grandfather. The boy was Mickey Mantle. Mickey married Merlin Johnson, a girl from Picher. Mutt Mantle never stopped mining, and the dust never stopped accumulating in his lungs. The disease was called silicosis, and by the 1930s, it was killing tri-state miners at a rate that even the companies couldn't pretend to ignore. The mines produced enormous quantities of silica dust, fine enough to penetrate deep into lung tissue, where it scarred the alveoli and slowly suffocated the men who breathed it. Tuberculosis followed the silicosis because damaged lungs couldn't fight infection, liver cancer, lung cancer, heart disease. The miners who survived long enough to retire often didn't survive long enough to collect much of their pensions. In 1928, the U.S. Bureau of Mines set up a clinic in Picher to study the problem. The resulting report, produced in cooperation with the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company and the Tri-State Zinc and Lead Ore Producers Association, documented what the miners already knew: the dust was killing them. But the Producers Association, dominated by Eagle-Picher, fought every attempt at regulation. When the International Union of Mine, Mill, and Smelter Workers began organizing in the district in 1933, Eagle-Picher and the association refused to recognize it. In May 1935, the union called a strike. Eagle-Picher's response was swift and ruthless. The company helped create a rival organization called the Blue Card Union, a company-sponsored outfit with no interest in safety standards or wage negotiations. Using hired enforcers, the local sheriff, and eventually the Oklahoma National Guard, the Blue Card broke the strike. Miners who'd walked out were blacklisted. The International Union filed charges with the newly created National Labor Relations Board and eventually won. Eagle-Picher was found to have illegally interfered with union organization, but the practical damage was done. The company's grip on the district remained. That same year, 1935, U.S. Secretary of Labor Frances Perkins toured the Tri-State District. She visited Treese, Kansas, where she met a miner named William Hannon. Hannon and two other former miners told Perkins they had silicosis and could not get treatment. Hannon's wife and 4 children also had it. The dust came home on the miners' clothes, settled into the floorboards, got into the food. Perkins then met with 6 women who described themselves as miners' widows. All said their children were sick with the same disease that had killed their husbands. Perkins' bus drove through Hockerville and Picher without stopping. From her seat, she could see what the report would later call slum conditions. She could also see the chat piles, already taller than the buildings. Nobody thought to test the children who played on them. The Second World War revived the Picher field one more time. Demand for lead and zinc surged again. By some estimates, 75% of the lead in American bullets and bomb casings during both World Wars came from the Tri-State District. The metal that won the wars came out of the ground beneath Ottawa County, processed in the mills along Connell Avenue, loaded onto rail cars, and shipped to ammunition factories across the country. Eagle-Picher, which had spent the Depression years surviving on cash reserves from the 1920s, suddenly had more orders than it could fill. In 1938, the company had acquired the Commerce Mining and Royalty Company for $10 million, a significant deal that brought additional ore reserves, several mills, and the Northeast Oklahoma Railroad under one corporate umbrella. George Washington Potter, a veteran of the Tri-State Mines, had pushed for the acquisition. The commerce deal extended the productive life of the district by another 2 decades, and the railroad gave Eagle-Picher direct control over the transportation of its own ore. It was the kind of vertical integration that looked brilliant in wartime and irrelevant afterward, because the economics were already turning. After the war, cheaper foreign zinc from Mexico, from Peru, from Australia flooded the market. The richest deposits in Ottawa County were played out. In the late 1930s, the introduction of diesel trucks and mechanized equipment had reduced the need for manpower, and the district began shedding workers. Federal subsidies kept some mines operating longer than the market justified, but it was a managed decline, not a reversal. The population of Picher dropped from its 1926 peak of 14,252 to 5,848 by 1940 and to 2,553 by 1960. Each census was smaller than the last. Each year, a few more houses went empty. The chat piles didn't shrink. They never shrank. They just stood there, getting grayer, as the town around them got quieter. Eagle-Picher ceased production in the Picher field in 1967. When the last pumps shut down, water began filling the mines. What the town looked like in those years was a study in slow subtraction. The head frames came down. The mills fell silent, then fell apart. The commercial buildings on Connell Avenue lost tenants one by one. A pharmacy closing here, a cafe going dark there. But people stayed. Not everyone, and not happily, but enough to sustain a school district, a few churches, a sense of continuity. Picher couldn't attract new industry. The real estate situation made that nearly impossible. A majority of the land still belonged to restricted Quapaw heirs. tangled in federal trust arrangements that made conventional development deals impractical. And then there was the more fundamental problem, the one nobody wanted to say out loud: who would build a factory on ground that was honeycombed with abandoned mine tunnels? So the town shrank. The population fell to 1,640 by the 2000 census. The school district still graduated classes. The guerrillas still played ball. Picher sat just a quarter-mile off Old Route 66, close enough that travelers might have glimpsed the chat piles from the highway and wondered what they were. The company moved on. By the 1970s, Eagle-Picher had diversified into industrial products, automotive parts, electronic components, even batteries for NASA spacecraft. The name Picher became a corporate legacy, not a place. Oliver S. Picher was long dead. The drill rig that got stuck in the mud was long scrapped. But what the company left behind in Ottawa County was just getting started. 70 million tons of chat piles, 36 million tons of mill sand and sludge, 1,400 mine shafts, 450 of them still open, and beneath the streets, the schools, the churches, and the houses, a network of tunnels covering more than 3,500 acres with a total volume of roughly 80,000 acre-feet. An underground void the size of a lake with a town sitting on top of it. The exploration boreholes that had mapped the ore deposits decades earlier had been plugged at the surface with sections of telephone pole or simply left open. The low-grade ore and waste rock that miners had tossed aside underground sat in the abandoned drifts, its pyrite and marcasite slowly oxidizing in the dark, generating the acid that would eventually contaminate the water table. The water was the first sign that something had gone terribly wrong. When the mines were operating, pumps ran constantly to keep the tunnels dry. When the pumps stopped in 1967, groundwater began seeping back in. It filled the tunnels slowly. 76,800 acre-feet of water, rising through shattered rock and abandoned ore, dissolving heavy metals as it went. By 1973, this contaminated water had begun leaking out of the old mine openings and into Tar Creek, which flows through Ottawa County on its way to the Neosho River. Tar Creek turned orange. Not metaphorically. The water ran the color of rust, iron oxide, dissolved zinc, dissolved lead, all pouring out of the hillsides in bright, toxic plumes. Fish died. The vegetation along the creek banks withered. The orange water seeped into the Boone Aquifer, which supplied drinking water to the surrounding communities. By the late 1970s, it was impossible to look at Tar Creek and not understand that something beneath the surface was deeply, fundamentally broken. In 1980, a task force was organized to investigate. In 1983, the Environmental Protection Agency placed the Picher area on its national priorities list as the Tar Creek Superfund site, 40 square miles of contaminated land, one of the largest and most toxic designations in the country. The EPA would eventually spend more than $300 million on the site. The creek still runs orange, but the water was only half the problem. The other half was in the air. The chat piles, those mountains of crushed rock, some of them 300 feet high, visible from satellites, were not inert. Wind carried dust off their surfaces in every direction. That dust contained lead, zinc, cadmium, arsenic, and manganese. It settled on lawns, in gardens, on windowsills, in the soil of playgrounds. It got into the groundwater. It got into the wells. It got into the houses. And it got into the children. For decades, the kids of Picher had treated the chat piles as the best feature of the landscape. A man named McWatters, who grew up in the area, later described it to a reporter. Wintertime was perfect for sliding down. They'd grab a piece of cardboard or the hood of a junked car and toboggan down the slopes of crushed rock. They swam in the ponds that formed around the bases of the piles, where contaminated runoff collected in bright, strange colors. No one told them not to. No one knew. Or at least, no one who knew said anything to the people who lived there. In 1993, a study tested the blood of children in the Picher area. 35% had elevated lead levels. A follow-up screening in 1994, conducted by the EPA at high-access areas like schoolyards and daycare centers, confirmed the scope of the crisis. Roughly 1 in 3 children in the 5-city mining area had enough lead in their blood to cause developmental delays, learning disabilities, behavioral problems, and permanent neurological damage. The levels were far above state averages. Lead accumulates in the body. It cannot be easily removed. The damage to a developing brain is irreversible. A generation of Picher's children had been quietly poisoned by the same ground they played on. The EPA responded with a remediation program that must have felt, to anyone watching, like a parable about futility. Workers in protective gear scraped contaminated soil from residential yards, 6 inches deep, sometimes more, and replaced it with clean fill. They did the same at school grounds, playgrounds, and public parks. But the chat piles were still there, rising 200 and 300 feet into the Oklahoma wind. And the wind did what wind does. Dust blew off the piles and settled right back onto the clean soil. Within months, the lead concentrations had crept back up. The EPA tried again. The dust returned again. They launched public education campaigns telling parents to keep their children away from the chat and to wash their hands after playing outside. They tested more children. The numbers improved somewhat. A 50% reduction in elevated blood lead levels over the course of years, the EPA reported, but the fundamental problem was structural, not behavioral. The poison was in the landscape. You couldn't educate your way out of 70 million tons of contaminated rock. Mutt Mantle died of Hodgkin's disease on May 7, 1952, in Denver. He was 40 years old. His father, Charlie Mantle, the same man who'd pitched left-handed to Mickey in that commerce yard, had also worked the mines and also died of Hodgkin's disease before he was 50. Mickey's uncle died of it, too. Mickey spent his entire career with the Yankees believing this was simply the Mantle curse, that the men in his family were destined to die young, that he himself wouldn't see 40. He didn't learn until much later that inhaling lead and zinc dust in the mines can cause Hodgkin's disease. The mine that in all likelihood killed his father kept operating for 15 years after Mutt was buried. The EPA didn't designate the area a Superfund site until 31 years after his death, and the last residents of Picher weren't cleared out until 2009, 57 years after Mutt Mantle died, and the town had gone right on producing dust the entire time. Mickey Mantle died in 1995 at 63, outliving his father's prediction, but not by as much as he should have. His son Billy died of Hodgkin's disease at 36. 5 miles up the road from the Commerce House, where Mickey learned to switch hit, the chat piles of Picher stood exactly where they'd always stood, growing nothing, going nowhere. In 2006, the Army Corps of Engineers released a subsidence evaluation report for the Picher mining field. The findings were staggering. 86% of the buildings in Picher, including the town's school, were badly undermined by abandoned mine workings and subject to collapse at any time. The pillars of rock that miners had left in place to support the tunnel ceilings had, in some cases, been mined out as the deposits thinned. No records were kept of which pillars remained and which had been removed. The ground beneath Picher was riddled with voids that no one could fully map. Sinkholes had already begun appearing, some of them swallowing entire sections of yard, opening into black holes that dropped hundreds of feet into flooded tunnels. One sinkhole near the town measured 250 feet across. Where it opened, there had been 3 mine shafts, each 5 feet by 7, visible at the surface. Now there was a lake. The Corps' recommendation was unambiguous. The town should be vacated. The federal government began offering buyouts. Many residents were reluctant. Picher had been home for 3, sometimes 4 generations. People had been born in these houses, married in these churches, buried their parents in nearby cemeteries. The buyout amounts were modest, enough to relocate, not enough to replicate a life. And some people simply refused. Jack Green, who was 91 in 2014 and had worked the mines from 1938 to 1941 before being drafted, told reporters he remembered the tremors from the mines shaking pencils off the desks at the high school. He also remembered why the ground was unstable. "They let people destroy this country from being so greedy," he said, describing the practice of mining out the support pillars that had been left in place for safety. Then the tornado came. On May 10, 2008, a Saturday afternoon, a supercell that had been building over northern Washington County, Oklahoma, dropped a tornado southwest of Chetopa, Kansas. It moved east-southeast, rapidly intensifying, feeding on the tropical moisture that had pushed up from the Gulf into an atmosphere made violently unstable by daytime heating. By the time it crossed the state line into Ottawa County and reached Picher, it was an EF4, with winds estimated at 175 miles per hour, and it was nearly a mile wide. It struck the southern portion of town and cut through a 20-block stretch, flattening frame houses into kindling, peeling roofs off masonry buildings, tossing vehicles like bottles. 6 people were killed in Picher, 2 men and 4 women. 150 were injured. More than 150 homes were destroyed or rendered uninhabitable. The tornado continued east, clipping the north side of Quapaw, then spawning a second tornado that merged with the first near Interstate 44. The combined vortex re-intensified as it crossed into Newton County, Missouri, where it killed 15 more people, including a volunteer firefighter who had been spotting the storm and a family of 5 driving to a wedding. One vehicle near the intersection of Highway 43 and Iris Road was thrown 5/8 of a mile. 21 people died total. Over 300 were injured. For any other town, a disaster of that scale would have triggered federal rebuilding assistance. But Picher was not any other town. The evacuation plan was already in place. The ground beneath the rubble was already condemned. The government declined to fund reconstruction and instead accelerated the buyout. The tornado, which had destroyed so many homes, had also settled the argument about whether to leave. Things moved quickly after that. In April 2009, the remaining residents voted 55-6 to dissolve the Picher-Cardin School District. The district's enrollment had dropped from about 340 students to 49. In May, the last class graduated, 11 seniors, walking across a stage in a gymnasium that sat on ground the Army Corps had classified as at risk of sudden collapse. The guerrillas played their last game. The Coca-Cola-sponsored scoreboard in the gym went dark. By June 29, 2009, every remaining resident had received a federal check. The post office closed in July. On September 1, 2009, the city of Picher officially ceased operations as a municipality. The last residents gathered in the school auditorium to say goodbye. Some of them had lived in Picher their entire lives. Some had never lived anywhere else. The demolition crews came next. By January 2011, almost all remaining commercial structures had been torn down. 6 homes and 1 business remained, their owners having refused to leave at any price. The business belonged to a man named Gary Linderman, who ran a place called the Old Miners Pharmacy, later renamed, with grim humor, as a kind of general store and last outpost. Linderman called himself the last man standing and told reporters he'd stay until every other resident was gone. He lived in a town where the nearest neighbor might be blocks away, where the streets ended in rubble, where the only reliable company was the wind coming off the chat piles. He stayed for years. He died in 2015, at 60, in a hospital in Joplin. By 2014, the standing buildings could be counted on 2 hands. The high school, a Christian church losing its paint among leafless trees, the mining museum housed in the old Tri-State Zinc and Lead Ore Producers Association building, which had been placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1997, and a handful of mercantile structures slowly returning to the earth. In April 2015, the museum was destroyed by arson. Its archives had already been shipped to the Dobson Museum in Miami, Oklahoma, and to Pittsburgh State University in Kansas. The last physical record of the industry that built the town was now housed in other people's towns. The water tower still stood. It read, Picher, Gorillas since 1918. A fiberglass gorilla, the old school mascot, sat on a corner at East 22nd Road in Columbus. Someone kept giving it a fresh coat of paint. A New York Times headline from September 2009 captured the absurdity of Picher's final chapter in 5 words. Welcome to our town. We wish we weren't here. The story noted what any visitor could see, that Picher had become something genuinely unprecedented in American history. Not a ghost town in the Western sense, where the mines played out and people drifted away over decades, leaving picturesque ruins for tourists. Picher was a modern, functioning American community that had been erased, deliberately, systematically, by the same federal government that had facilitated the mining leases in the first place. The irony was structural, not incidental. The Bureau of Indian Affairs had managed the leases on Quapaw land. The federal government had demanded the lead and zinc for 2 world wars. Federal subsidies had kept the mines running past their economic viability, and now the federal government was spending hundreds of millions of dollars to undo what it had spent decades encouraging. The Quapaw, whose land it had always been, were left with a reservation that was 80% Superfund site. In 2002, the Quapaw Nation sued the Department of the Interior for the damage caused by the BIA's decisions. The leases signed over their objections. The toxic chat the BIA had told the companies to leave on the surface, the aquifer contaminated by mine drainage. After nearly 2 decades of litigation, the case was settled in 2019 for $137.5 million, divided among all enrolled members of the Quapaw Nation. It was a fraction of what the land had produced, a fraction of the cleanup cost, and a fraction of what the damage had taken. But the Quapaw did something that no one else had managed in 40 years of Superfund designation. They started cleaning it up themselves. Beginning in 2013, the Quapaw Nation contracted with the EPA to conduct remediation on their own land, the land that had been their reservation since 1834, the land whose minerals had been extracted under leases they hadn't voluntarily signed, the land where 80% of their reservation had been designated a federal Superfund site. A Cherokee environmental scientist named Summer King joined the project in 2016. Under her direction, the tribe began hauling away the chat piles, not studying them, not monitoring them, not writing reports about them, but physically removing them, truckload by truckload, ton by ton. A pile that had stood 70 feet high was reduced to nearly nothing. The cleared ground was graded, planted, and converted into wetlands. Where mountains of toxic waste had stood for a century, cattails grew in shallow water. The land would never be residential again, King acknowledged, and never commercial. But it could be usable. It could grow something. The creek still runs orange. The aquifer is still contaminated. The underground voids are still there, and the sinkholes are, in King's words, repeat offenders. Fill one in, and it collapses again, swallowing whatever was placed on top. But for the first time in over a century, the direction of change had reversed. Ore was no longer being pulled out of the ground. Waste was being taken off of it. There is one more thing that happens in Picher, and it happens every year. On the first Saturday of December, pickup trucks start pulling into the parking lot of an abandoned auction house at the corner of Connell Street and East 20th Road. Flatbed trailers arrive, and ATVs from the Quapaw Nation, and classic cars driven by men and women who haven't lived in Picher for years. A woman named Suman, she graduated from Picher High in 1984, the year the football team won the Oklahoma 1A state championship, stands at a microphone and announces each entry as a Christmas parade winds through streets that no longer have addresses. They call it the Coming Home for Christmas Parade. Suman and the women who organized the first one in 2015 call themselves the Chat Rats. The name started as something close to a slur, a label for people who grew up in the shadow of the piles, who sledded down the toxic waste on cardboard, who swam in the contaminated ponds, who breathed the dust every day of their childhoods and only learned what it was doing to them decades later. They took the name back. They put it on T-shirts. They wore them to the parade. For an hour or so, each December, the ghost town has a population again. Former residents find each other. They hug. They point to where things used to be. The pharmacy was there. The church was there. The school was there. The one where the pencils shook off the desks when the blasting went off underground. They are standing on ground that the Army Corps of Engineers classified as liable to collapse beneath them, surrounded by chat piles that are still being hauled away, breathing air that a federal agency once declared unfit for habitation. They come back anyway. The parade route passes the Gary Building, then heads down what was Connell Avenue, past the empty lots where commercial buildings stood for decades before being demolished, past the corner where the fiberglass gorilla still sits with its fresh paint, past the water tower that still says Gorillas since 1918. There is no marching band from the high school because there is no high school. There are no floats from local businesses because there are no local businesses. What there are is people who remember a town that existed briefly because a drill rig got stuck in the mud and a man in Joplin said, "Drill where you are." The parade ends. The trucks pull out. The parking lot empties. The chat piles stay. Today, if you drive north on U.S. Highway 69 through Ottawa County, you pass through Miami, then Commerce, where Mickey Mantle's boyhood house still stands, a cracked sign on the front, a tin shed in the back where the greatest switch hitter in baseball history learned to turn on a fastball thrown by a miner who would be dead at 40. 5 miles farther north, you reach what used to be Picher. The road is still there, because the road connects Oklahoma to Kansas, and people still need to drive on it. On either side of it, where a town of 14,000 once stood, there are empty lots, low scrub, broken concrete foundations, and the piles. From above, from a satellite or an airplane, the Picher field looks like an anomaly in the green grid of agricultural land. Huge gray blots interrupt the geometry of roads and section lines. Dark pools sit where the earth has caved in. Tar Creek threads through it all, its water the color of iodine. Up to 30% of the Picher mining field sat on restricted Quapaw land. The regulations required more mine shafts and more mills than were technically necessary to extract the ore, because no single operator could work across lease boundaries. The result was an industrial landscape of astonishing, almost pathological density. More holes, more mills, more chat, more poison than the geology strictly demanded. The bureaucracy that was supposed to protect the Quapaw's interests had instead maximized the damage to their land. The Tri-State Zinc and Lead Ore Producers Association building is gone, burned in 2015, its archives scattered to museums in other towns. The school is gone, the churches are gone, the pharmacy is gone, the houses are gone. The 6 families who reportedly still live in the area are not technically living in Picher because Picher does not exist. It was officially dissolved as a municipality on November 26, 2013. There is a Quapaw Marshal's office, and there is the gorilla, and there is the water tower, and there are the piles. What the Picher field produced in total over its 55-year life was approximately 1.5 million metric tons of lead and 8 million metric tons of zinc, the raw material for bullets, batteries, galvanized steel, brass fittings, paint, pipes, and 100 other products that built 20th century America. The ore came out of the ground, was processed through the mills, and shipped by rail to smelters in Bartlesville, Collinsville, Henrietta, Sand Springs, and beyond. The metal went into the economy. The wealth went to the companies. The royalties, such as they were, went to a fraction of the Quapaw. The dust went into the miners' lungs. The chat went onto the piles. The lead went into the children's blood. And the ground, the 3,560 acres of underground workings, the 80,000 acre-feet of void space, stayed empty. The pillars that held up the town had been mined out. The pumps that kept the tunnels dry had been turned off. The water that filled the mines had dissolved the poison and carried it to the surface. Everything of value had been extracted, and what remained was the whole. Picher, Oklahoma, was not abandoned. It was used up. The chat piles stand in the sun. Wind lifts dust from their surfaces and carries it east, across the Kansas line. A creek runs beneath them, orange as rust.